Now we've,
Okay.
it's wonderful to all be together for my dad's 75th birthday and
I
to have
agree.
you here as part of the family. And now I want to go back and hear your family's history.
Okay. My mother and father both came from small towns in Austria, which was Austria then. I think that my father's town kept changing because it was near the Polish border. So sometimes it was Poland and sometimes it was Austria. Consequently, he could speak German, Polish, and of course, English.
Do you remember the name of the town?
I don't remember the names of the town. I have to ask my brother Harry, who's the expert on family history.
When did he come over?
He came to America, well, neither of them knew their actual birthdays because they never kept records. They really didn't know. My father knew he came over right after his bar mitzvah, and his descriptions of his trip over and everything were very, very interesting. And as soon as he came over, he was met by an older brother who was already here and who had a suitcase factory. And his older brother picked him up at the boat and took him around to see whatever relatives were already living there. And he started working in his brother's factory and didn't get along too well with his brother and didn't like the work, so he took off on his own and did get a job in another factory. And he was very handy. He could make, put things together and make and operate machinery and so on. And he went to night school and learned to read and write English. But he did spend the rest of his life working with machinery. He got a job some years later with General Motors in their Chevrolet plant. And he always used to talk about how he made roller bearings for the cars and how the same roller bearings went into the Cadillac as went into the Chevrolet. So as far as he was concerned.
That's where I got that from.
That's right, that's where he.
What was his name?
His Jewish name was Moshe, which translated in English to Morris. And my mother's name was Hannah, which became Anna. And she came to America when she was 10 years old and immediately went to work in a factory also. And I think, if I recall correctly, they were making rolled cigars in this factory. And she never went to school and never learned to read and write. She could speak English, not perfectly, but she could speak English. But when I was little, Yiddish was also the language that we spoke in our home. I knew Yiddish better until I went to school than I knew English. And they met in America. I don't recall exactly how they met, but she lived in New Jersey, my father lived in New York, and at that time what he described it at was he drove a horsey car. These horse-drawn cars. He met my mother, I believe, at a social function where all the greenhorns got together, and he pursued her. I mean, he evidently was crazy about her, and they were married. My recollections as a child was that my mother could not read or write English, and I used to sometimes be very embarrassed because we lived in a mixed neighborhood. It was not all Jewish. And I used to be embarrassed because she wasn't like the mothers of most of my friends or the kids that I went to school with. My father was a very kind of a jovial man. He would tell jokes and laugh. And I recall that as a child, he would come home with the newspaper every evening and sit down and read the newspaper to my mother. So she knew what was going on in the world because she couldn't read.
Did he read it in English or in Yiddish?
No, he read it in English to her, and but as is so typical of, I think, Jewish people of that era, they didn't have an education, but they wanted their children to be educated. And when I graduated from high school and was ready to go to college, I really had a great interest in certain things like medicine. And my father was horrified. He said to me, "A Jewish girl becomes either a social worker or a teacher. Which one do you want to be?"
A nurse. A nurse.
Well, I wanted to go into nursing or something like that, and he didn't think that was good. He wanted me to. So, being an obedient daughter, I went into teaching. And I went to a teacher's college in New Jersey and graduated. When I started college, I was only 17 years old, and I met a girl who had a sister the war had already started, and a sister who was a USO hostess. And one day she said, "Would you like to go to a dance at Camp Kilmer," which was
Now, before we go on to the next part of your life, there's a couple questions
Oh,
I'd
sure.
like to ask you. When your father came over, there were a couple great stories. One, how he hid on the boat. Can you?
well, not so much that he hid on the boat, but families generally didn't come over as large groups as families because they couldn't afford the price of the tickets. So they would send the sons over, and the sons would get jobs and would earn the money to bring, one by one, the rest of the family over. And he was just 13 years old, evidently, when he came over. And so he, somehow or other, they snuck him in on a half ticket instead of a full ticket. And he said he was way down in the hold of the ship, and he didn't have hardly any food with him. And so he attached himself to a family that was coming over as a family, and they had a lot of food with them. And they all got seasick, but he didn't. So he was able to eat their food, because I don't think they fed the passengers down in, the third class or whatever they were called at that time.
Steerage.
Steerage, yeah. And he was a very adventuresome guy. I mean, he joined the National Guard for a while, and he was very good looking. He was blonde and blue-eyed, and he enjoyed a lot of the things that he did.
What were your feelings toward your father and your mother?
Well, I have to admit that when I was a child, I was embarrassed by my mother. She was a typical Jewish mother. My younger brother and my younger brother Harry was a year and a half younger, and in the summertime we would go to a park that was 2 blocks away. They had counselors there, it didn't cost anything, it was a park. And my mother would come every day around 3 o'clock with milk and cookies for us. And none of the other mothers did that, particularly the kids that were not Jewish. And Harry and I used to be very embarrassed, and there was no way we could tell her not to come. We would tell her, but she just didn't listen. I mean, she wanted us to have milk and cookies in the middle of the afternoon. And she came from a family of 2 brothers and a sister. She was one of the middle children. There was, no, I guess 2. She had an older sister and 2 younger brothers. The older sister's name was Sadie. She had a very interesting life also. And she had 2 younger brothers, Charlie, who was a cab driver, and I've forgotten the name of the other one now. But she wasn't too close to her family. They all kind of spread out and, married and did different things. My father came from a large family. His father had died, and his mother had remarried, so he had a bunch of half-brothers and sisters. And they were also very interesting. They all lived in New York. We lived in New Jersey, so we used to go over to visit them, take the the Hudson Tubes, they called it at that time, and go over to New York. And his mother and stepfather were alive, and we would go visit them. I was very young, and I don't recall too much about it. And then eventually I remember that his mother and stepfather came to live with us for a while too, because in those days there were no nursing homes and things like that, and she wasn't well, and they lived with us for a while. But
Did you live in Newark your whole childhood?
Yeah. Well, actually not Newark. We lived in a suburb of Newark called Irvington, where my father had, during the Depression, before the Depression, bought a 4-family house so that they could have one of the apartments, and then they would have income from the other 3 apartments. But unfortunately, during the Depression, he couldn't pay the mortgage on the payments because he lost his job. And I do remember as a child that I was in kindergarten, and he was out of work. The automobile plants had shut down, and he was out of work for 9 months, and there was no unemployment compensation, and they used up all whatever they did have saved, and that's the time that they lost this house. And I remember that my mother, they were too proud to, some of the neighbors used to tell them, you can go here and go there, and they'll give you milk, and they wouldn't do it. They were just too proud to do it. They didn't want, so however they scraped together what they did, but we had no not that we had none of the finer things in life. I mean, we did have some toys, I remember, some games. Harry and I used to play games in the summertime when we were home. But we didn't have, you know, nice clothes or, and one thing we did though, we lived a few blocks away from a library. And one of the first things my mother did was take us over there. We had to get library cards. And once a week, Harry and I would walk to the library and take books out and bring them home, you know. And they were very into education is very important, and you have to have an education. And they...
Did all of you get an education?
Yes. And we did. And they found some money for that, although I went to a state college, so it was, you know, I lived at home, it was inexpensive. And my brother went to NYU and some other colleges and got his master's in social work, and to this day is a social worker. Had major surgery, and from that point on she was a semi-invalid. I was in high school at the time, and it was a very hard blow. She was not bedridden, but she really couldn't do much after that or go out of the house very much. But she did live for 20 years until the cancer returned when she was in her 70s, and she eventually died from that.
How did that affect you growing up?
When I was a teenager, I was 14, and it affected me greatly because I felt there was a lot of responsibility I then had. I started doing the cooking in the house and a lot of the shopping for food, and the war was on, and it was not easy. My brother and I did all of the housework when we came home from school, and you know, did the washing and all that. And
Bobby died 35 years ago yesterday.
Is that right? 35 years?
It was July 3rd, 1963, and today is July 4th, 1998. So it's 35 years in one day. I was just thinking.
And she died on the day of her wedding anniversary. They were married on July 3rd. I still have the wedding invitation that went out when they were married. But it was very difficult because, first of all, she was not, in my eyes anyhow, a modern woman. You know, she was old-fashioned, and she wore house dresses, and she wore her hair in a bun, you know, rolled in a bun on the back of her, on her neck and the back. And I was very with it, you know, when I was in high school and so on. And it was embarrassing to me that she was not an American woman who, like most of my friends had.
How did you feel about your father?
My father, whom I adored when I was little, and I can still remember things like I wanted a pair of roller skates very badly. And he was working the night shift, and I used to run to meet him when he'd come home in the morning. He worked like from the 12 to 8 o'clock shift.
It's a great answer.
Yeah, because they made more money, you know, working that shift. And I used to run to the bus to meet him when he got off the bus. And I had been asking for roller skates and asking for them, and it was my 9th birthday, and I remember running to the bus to meet him in the morning, because he probably got home around 9, you know, and it was probably a Saturday morning when I wasn't in school, and he had a pair of roller skates for me. And I was just the happiest kid in the block. I mean, that was a big thing. I roller skated up and down the street, and I really adored him. But as I got older, I be very frank and realized that my mother was a lot smarter than my father. You know, she really had yeah, I thought she was as I got older. She had a lot more street smarts, you know, shrewdness than he did. And he meant well, but he, you know, he would come and visit us when the kids were little. He came for the first time in his life on a plane, and that's a whole story in itself. And the tape isn't long enough for all the stories, unfortunately.
Because isn't he also the one who came here at 13 years old and said he could do a job that he couldn't do?
Oh yeah, he got hired. He couldn't speak a word of English, and he got in the line. He saw there was a factory, and he got in the line, and they were going to hire some people. And one guy came out, and he looked around, and my father was blonde and blue-eyed, so this guy was Polish, and he thought my father was Polish, so he pointed to him and asked him in English if he asked him in Polish if he was Polish, and my father could understand Polish, and asked him if he could work certain machinery, and he said yes, you know, which he couldn't. He'd never seen the machines before in his life, but he gave him the job, And when this guy realized that he really didn't know, he helped him instead of, he had some of the other men help him to learn how to operate some of this machinery in the automobile plant. And that's how he, began his life's work.
So now that we've regressed, tell us how you met Vic.
Well, I met him when I first only going to college a couple of months, and this girlfriend of mine said her sister was a hostess, a USO hostess, and if we could go to a dance if we wanted to, even though we were underage. We weren't supposed to be going. We were supposed to be 21, and I was 17, and she was maybe 18. But her sister would let us get on the bus and go to the dance, so we thought that was terrific, and we went to a dance at Camp Kilmer. And when we got there, there were none of the fellows were there, just this whole busload of girls. And we were told that the fellows had a new batch had just come in that morning, because this was an embarkation point where they were shipped overseas, and they came there and they stayed there for a few days until I guess they were ready to go overseas, and then they went overseas. And so the girls were all sitting around at this very nice USO building, and the fellows began to drift in. The soldiers began to drift in one by one. They had been to a movie or whatever, and he came in with another fellow, and a fellow had come in before, a soldier had come in before him and asked me to dance, and we were dancing, and he came over. He knew the guy that I was dancing with. They had gone to school together, but they had come from different camps. They hadn't seen each other since they left high school. So that's how I met him, because I was dancing with somebody he knew. And that guy disappeared, and we sat down and talked and so on, and then began our romance. And he was in the States about a week and a half before he got shipped overseas, but he would get, at that time, what they called 8-hour passes. And he would get on the bus from Camp Kilmer and come to Newark. And I was going to school at the time, to this teacher's college, but I lived at home. And he'd come, and I'd come home from school, and he would be sitting in the kitchen talking to my mother while she was preparing dinner and so on. And that's how our romance began. And about a week and a half later, he was shipped out. I didn't know he'd been shipped out, and I told him I would come up again to the USO on this evening, and I was bringing him. And I knew he was going overseas, and I knew that he was religious, and I remember that I bought him a mezuzah to wear with his dog tags. But when I got there, they weren't there anymore. They had been shipped out, so I didn't see him. But of course, all the kids know the story about how I sent him the package then, because I wanted to send the mezuzah to him for good luck. So in the package, I put a can of gefilte fish and whatever. My mother had done some baking and, made a package and sent it overseas. And of course, the story was that I got a letter back saying that package saved his life, because when he got it, they were going through Czechoslovakia, and the war was still on. He was shipped over in February, and the war ended in June. And he had opened up the package and put the mezuzah around his neck, which after a while he lost. But the can of fish he put on in his neck, the thing on his back that they carried, because he wanted to open it on Friday night and eat it Friday night. And while they were in the fighting, a piece of shrapnel hit the can, and he fell to the ground, and the shrapnel was embedded in the can of fish, and had he not had it there, it would have gone into his back. So he very romantically decided that it had saved his life. And he came back in June which really surprised me, because they were some of the last troops that went over, but they were some of the first ones that came home. And of course, I didn't realize at the time that the reason they came home so quickly was that they were the first ones to go over to Japan then, because we were still at war with Japan. And he came home, and he was at some port in Maine, I believe, where they came. And he called me from there, and he was so excited that he was back, and he wanted me to come to Chicago to meet his parents. Well, that was unheard of in those days. My mother said, "You don't go to Chicago to meet anybody, Where is Chicago?" And so, that's that all of those stories would take up 3 more tapes.
Well, now you have to do a double job, because you're going to have to tell us about his family. So,
well, he came from, his mother and father both had come from Russia. And I guess they had family in Chicago, so instead of ending up in New York or New Jersey, where a lot of them did, they ended up in Chicago. And his grandparents, the grandparents on his mother's side were not alive when I met him, but the grandparents on his father's side were. And his grandfather was a very religious man.
Do you remember his name?
Well, his name was, I think I don't remember his name now. I don't remember their names. They're, Jewish names or English names, but, no, her name was Faggy. I remember that because one of the grandchildren was named after her. But he was a very religious man. He never worked a day in his life. All he did was study the Torah and go to shul twice a day. She worked, and she had maybe 8 or 9 children, and they opened up a store. Now, my father-in-law was the eldest son, and he came over to America first and
What was his name?
That was Hyman. That was Victor's father, and he came over to America first, and he worked and sent money so that, well, he sent money, and he wanted his father to come over.
How old was he when he came over to you?
He must have been about 16 or 17, and he sent money for his father to come over, and his father, I guess, wrote back and said, "I don't come without your mother." Because religious men, their wives were important to them. Friday night was the night of the week, and he wanted, and his wife provided all the comforts for him. So they had to work some more, and he had to work some more until he had enough money for the fare for both of them, and then they came over. And they opened up a little, I think it was a grocery store, if I recall correctly, which she tended. He didn't work in the store at all. He sat in the house and studied the Torah. My father-in-law was the eldest, and then one by one the younger ones came over, and they were a very close family, the Prof family. And I heard your dad's story, and he would do this too with his grandsons. They would, on their way home from Cheder, from Hebrew school, they would have to stop at his house every day to tell him what they had learned, and repeat it and so on. He pushed their Hebrew education. And Vic was one of 3, he was the youngest of 3 brothers, and the eldest one was a very sharp student, became a lawyer before he was 21 years old. He was too young to take the bar. He had to wait several months to take the bar exam. And Seymour...
That was Manly.
That was Manly, and Seymour was the middle one, and he was a pilot during World War II, so when he came back, he was able to go to Harvard with the GI Bill, and he was also a lawyer, became a lawyer, and Vic came back from the war. See, they were all able to go to school at that time, like your dad, because of the GI Bill, which would have been much more difficult. But the problem was that they couldn't get into a lot of the colleges. The colleges became so overcrowded in a very short period of time. But so he went to Roosevelt College for a year, and
what was his mother's name?
His mother's name was Lena, and she was a very, in my eyes, a very charming woman. She had red hair, and she was very bubbly and very emotional. And they did not really have a happy marriage.
How many siblings did she have?
She had, I think there were 6 of them in her family. Yeah, 3 girls and three boys. And
she used to tell the future too, didn't she?
Yeah, she was very emotional and very perceptive. And she had this thing where she would tell with cards. She would, deal the cards, and however she did it, and she would tell you your future.
You were very close to her.
I was very close to her. Yeah, because.
How about? Oh, go ahead.
Because after we got married, we went out to California, and they had moved to California, and my own parents were in New Jersey, and I really had more to talk about with her because she was much more Americanized than my mother was.
What was Hyman like?
Well, he was was a very unique kind of personality. He really was. He was had a very strong personality, very strong ideas, and he thought things should be the way he thought they should be. But you know, some of his ideas and suggestions were not far off base. It's just that he didn't really know how to make friends and influence people.
Was Vic happy in that family?
I think he was, yeah. You know, but they were very turbulent years. There was not like most people at that time. There was very little money in their family too. And then by the time he was a teenager, the war had broken out, which is what happened with the rest of us. And he joined the ROTC when he was in high school, and he left high school before he really finished. His mother went to the graduation ceremonies to get his diploma. He was a senior, but he was 17, and he enlisted. What do they call that? For officers. He wanted to become an officer. No, it was. I've forgotten what they called it.
Well, there was an ASTP program.
Well, I know
but
they
that
sent
was
him.
When you joined the Army. But
well, he had this ROTC background, so he was going to become an officer, and there was officers training or whatever they called it. No.
well,
think
there-
so. Officers training.
no, that was once you got into the Army
Well,
or the Air Force.
In any
Anyway,
case, they
anyway.
sent him to the University of Michigan to do for some kind of training, and while he was there in training, there was an epidemic of measles, and he'd never had measles as a child, so he had measles while he was in the service in this training program, and he had a very severe case of measles, and while he was, you know, ill, the war took a sudden turn for the worse, and they took all of these fellas that were in training for officers and put them in the infantry, and they shipped him down to Texas and for training in the infantry. And when he was finished with that training, then that's when they were shipping him overseas, and they brought him, you know, they brought the whole thing up to Camp Kilmer, and by this time he had turned 18. And when I met him, he was 18 and I was 17, but he lied to me and told me he was 19 because he wanted to impress me. Now you look at young men of 19 today, and they're nowhere near as mature as the young men were at that time because of the war, you know, really. And the war years, I remember as such turbulent years. There was rationing and things that went on, but we were also patriotic. I mean, we wanted to fight Hitler, and all the young men were gone, and you did a lot of things that you thought you were supposed to do to help the country. So
Tell us about when you got married then and the kids.
well, we got married. When he came back from the war, we had to find a way to get together. He lived in Chicago and I lived in New Jersey, and it wasn't common at that